Hello, I can see people starting to join today's revision skills hints and tips session. Welcome. I'm going to give it another sort of few moments to allow other people to join. Welcome, everyone. As you've probably already seen, the session is being recorded, so don't worry if you're not able to sort of join on time or if you need to leave a bit earlier. The session will be shared with you, so you'll be able to review all of the content when it's convenient for you. So we are just past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and make a start. Don't worry, you're not going to miss anything if you are joining a bit later, but we will make a start for everyone that's here. So again, welcome to everyone who's joined us from wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's revision skills hints and tips session. So my name is Bethany. I'm the International Officer for the Faculty of Medicine, Health, Life Science here at Swansea University, and very pleased to be joined today by our very own Professor Phil Newton, who's going to give you some fantastic sort of revision skills of hints and tips. So I know that many of you will be kind of going into the exam period very imminently. So the aim of today's session really is just to give you some kind of fun information to give you best chance of, trying to harness the power of your brain to get the most out of it as you approach your exams. So I'm going to hand over to Phil shortly. As we go along, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you do have any questions. I do already have some questions that those of you who have registered have already submitted, so we'll get around to all of those questions at the end of the presentation. But as we go along, if there are any questions that you think that you would like to ask for the end of the session, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So that's all the housekeeping. And I know that we are going to have an interactive part of the session today. So please do, you haven't got to be, you're obviously not going to be seen or anything, but please do use the chat function to get involved with the fun activity that Professor Newton's got for you. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor Newton.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And as you were saying, we are going to use the chat just to engage in one small activity. So I'm just going to put a message in the chat, make sure that that works. And if you could, participants, just do the same, just to let me know that it's working, at least one or two of you, and we can make sure that the activity will work as well.
So I think, Phil, that you have sent that to hosts and panelists, if you're able to just drop down the box to everyone.
Let's try again. That's another way of making sure that it works. That worked, did it? Okay.
Yeah, that's appeared to everyone.
Folks, I need you to respond to me. Now, whilst you are figuring out how to do that, I will share my screen. Okay. Am I sharing? Okay, and we have a question. All right. Well, Fatima, we will definitely get to that. In order for me to do that, we're gonna do a short activity, and that will allow me to explain how the brain processes and stores new information and how we can improve the learning and information process as we do it. So let me go back. Actually, what we're going to do is we got half an hour or so. I'm going to give you a very, very basic introduction to how humans learn and then how we can use that to study and to revise. Explain to you who I am and why I'm here. So I am a neuroscientist by background, and a big part of what I do is teach on our master's course in medical neuroscience. And that program is largely focused on explaining how the brain works through the lens of what happens when it goes wrong, because there's a lot about our brain going wrong that teaches us a lot about how it works under normal, healthy conditions. I also teach on our master's course in medical education, which is a program where we teach doctors how to teach so that they can teach future generations. And a lot of what I teach on our medical education program is the application of the basic science and neuroscience and neuropsychology of learning to learning and teaching. So that's largely what we're going to cover in the short session that we have this morning. What we're going to do, though, is rather than me spend half an hour telling you how this works, we are going to do a very short activity. And what I'm going to do is I have a list of words right here, I'm going to read out this list of words. And then once I've read out the list of words, I'm going to show you some words on the screen. And what I want you to do is to tell me whether the word that appears on the screen was in the list of words that I read out previously. Okay? And if you can just put yes or no in the chat as to whether or not you thought the word on the screen appeared on the list that I'm about to read out, that should, even with a modest number of us, allow us to demonstrate some of the key features about how and why people learn. Okay, so I'm going to play a short game. I'm going to read out this list of words, and I just want you to listen to them. Don't write anything down, just listen to me read them out, and then I'll ask you some questions about them, okay? So the list of words is as follows: smooth, bumpy, road, tough, sandpaper, jagged, ready, coarse, uneven, riders, rugged, sand, boards, ground, and gravel. Okay? Standard list of words. Just read out to you one at a time. I want you to tell me yes or no. Was the word ChatGPT on the list of words that I just read out? Sea of no's. Okay. Was the word gravel on the list of words that I just read out? Yes, it was indeed. Was the word coarse on the list of words that I just read out? Some more yeses. Yes, it was. Was the word slalom on the list of words that I just read out? No. Was the word rough on the list of words that I just read out? Yes, 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 yes. 5 yeses. So the word rough was not on the list of words that I just read out. Okay. Now, the reason we've done that little activity is just to demonstrate some very basic principles about how we learn. If you said yes, you thought the word rough was on the list, you are in good company. We've just recreated an experiment from 26 years ago. And in that experiment, when people were asked, was the word rough on the list? 83% of them said yes, that it was. And in another version of that experiment, where people were just asked to write down what words did you hear read out on that list, more than half of them said that they heard the word rough, when the word rough was not on the list. So here's the list of words that I did read out. You can see there are lots of words that have meanings that are similar to or could be linked to the word rough. And obviously then there's also the word tough, which sounds a bit like the word rough. The key feature then, the reason we've done this activity, is to illustrate 3 points. We know what all those words mean. Many of you could speak those words in multiple languages. You could speak those words, use those words in a sentence. I could ask you to use a synonym for those words, a similar sounding word, and you could do all of those things. If I ask you just to remember that list of words, though, for a few seconds, we struggle really to do that. And when we do try and remember the list of words for a few seconds, we make mistakes. All right, and that's what we've just done. We think the word rough was on the list when it wasn't. And the reason for that is because of the way that our brain stores information that it has learned, what the psychologist would call a schema or a schemata. All the words that are on the list have some things in common, some level of meaning that is in common. Coarse and uneven and gravel, they all have some sense of meaning that is similar. And we could expand that list of words to other words that have a similar set of meaning or have some overlap in what their meaning is. And within that, we could include the word rough. Okay, so if I'd asked you about rough or beard or brush or abrasive or stubble, you might also have said, yes, you thought it was on the list because it has an overlap in meaning with the words that were on the list. What does this mean then for how human beings learn? Now, very simply, when we try and classify our memory, there are 3 basic ways in which we can classify the types of memory that we use as we try and learn something. Okay, the first of those is what we might call short-term memory. So short-term memory is basically the fact that your eyes, your ears, your skin, your sense receptors, your taste, etc., your sensory systems are processing huge amounts of information. So if you can see the screen here, you can see that the text is dark blue on a light blue font. Your eyes are processing that, but you probably wouldn't remember that until I had drawn your attention to it. Where we eventually want to get to is long-term memory. That's where essentially things go once we have learned them. And our long-term memory as humans is enormous. We have an astonishing capacity for learning new facts, skills, understanding, practical activities, etc. To get there, we have to get into short-term memory first of all. So your eyes and your ears are turning this external sensory information into electrical activity in your eyes and your ears and then going into your brain. Some of it you are paying attention to. And part of what happens when we pay attention to sensory information from our external and our internal world is we retrieve our prior knowledge of the similar things, or things that look or sound or taste or feel similar to the new thing that we're experiencing. Okay, so we take from our working memory, the information goes into that, and what our working memory does is it retrieves from long-term memory, where have we seen this before, or where have we heard something similar before? Eventually, what happens is once we get through working memory, we go into long-term memory and things are stored. But to get to long-term memory, we have to go through working memory. And one of the key messages when we're trying to learn or revise or study anything is that working memory is absolutely hopeless. So all humans have terrible working memory, and yet most of the things that you will be revising over the course of the next little while, few months or even years through a lifelong learning, they have to get through working memory to get there. So if we go back to our list of words, if I ask you what do those words mean, can you use them in a sentence? Can you translate them into another language? You've learned those things. And importantly, you probably have never sat down with that list of words and tried to memorize it. You've learned it through exposure to those, the meanings of those words, but you've learned it nevertheless. Now, your long-term memory, our long-term memory as a species is really, really good. So you have learned the meaning of all of those words and it's stored in your long-term memory. However, when I read that list out to you and you try and hold on to it, you try and hold it in your mind for just a few seconds, then you are using your working memory. And our working memory, as I said before, is really, really bad. If you did badly, don't feel like you're in any way different to anybody else. For all humans, or almost all humans, our working memory is really poor. And when we try and rely on it to hold things in our mind for a few seconds, we make mistakes, because what we do is, rather than actually hold on to that list of words in our head, what you've done is you've retrieved your prior knowledge. Okay, so I've read out a list of words to you that has meaning that overlaps with the word rough, along with lots of other words. You haven't been able to hold on to that list of words by holding it in your head. Instead, that list of words has acted as a cue, as a memory trigger. And so you've retrieved a whole set of meanings and feelings and emotions related to those list of words. And then when I've asked you, was the word rough on the list? It feels like it was on the list because you've retrieved a set of meanings and a set of sensations of which rough is part of the set of learning, the set of meaning that you've retrieved. That's why we make mistakes when we do those sorts of activities. What we've actually done in that experiment is an old experiment that's called the implantation of false memories. And there are all sorts of implications for the limitations of working memories for things like juries, for things like witness testimonies, but that's for another day. Let's stick to studying. So one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful and most useful study tactic that we teach our medical students, our university students, and our teachers is what's called retrieval practice. Okay, so when you retrieved your prior knowledge that included the word rough, that included meaning similar to the word rough, that process of retrieving prior knowledge really makes the learning of new information more effective. Essentially, when you're trying to learn something new, if you can retrieve your prior knowledge, you're basically putting it at the top of the pile for when their new learning goes in, and the new learning sticks to the old learning, the old thing that you've learned, and that makes learning more effective. The best way to do retrieval practice, or at least the old literature on the best way to do this, took advantage of what is called the testing effect. Now, the testing effect is a name that lots of students and teachers don't really like because it has the implication that we need to give students lots and lots of tests. But honestly, the testing effect, the principle of that is that the best way to learn is to take practice tests. And the testing effect is an old, very well-established principle from psychology that says if you want people to learn something and you give them practice tests, they will learn more effectively than any other type of study method that there is. And pretty much every other type of study, teaching and learning method has been studied and compared to practice tests, and almost nothing comes close. So the core principle then of this teaching, this revision strategy of retrieval practice, is to take practice tests. If you can, whenever you're studying, whether it's history, geography, biology, philosophy, you've got a test coming up, you've got an exam coming up, or you've got an essay to write. Doing practice versions of that is the best way to learn the content. Perhaps one of the only ways that's better than taking practice tests is to write your own practice tests and then share them with your peers. Okay, and some of the courses that I teach on, we put this into our assessments so that all of our students have to write exam questions and then share them with their peers. And that process of writing an exam question, of working through what the question will be, coming up with some incorrect answers and explaining to yourself why are they incorrect, why is the correct answer the correct one, that process really, really strengthens learning and makes it more effective. It doesn't have to be a test, and the psychologists use this phrase, bring to mind. So any sort of activity when you're revising that brings to mind your prior knowledge right at the beginning of a study session, before you start to revise or revisit something new, that will improve your chances of learning the thing that you're trying to revise by bringing to mind your prior knowledge. So it can be quizzes rather than tests, or if you want to, you can take a piece of paper and write down everything you know about something that you're trying to revise before you then go into the revision session to learn and reconsolidate your revision knowledge on that subject. If you're working or revising with friends, you can test each other. Okay, tell me everything you know about the history of the First World War or the biology of a seagrass or whatever it is that you're learning. Spend a couple of minutes just writing down or speaking out loud all of your things that you already know about this. That will bring your prior knowledge to the surface, and then the new things that you're going to learn are more likely to stick. Now, I've told you that retrieval practice works. Let me tell you a little bit of detail about that. When there's some reviews here that have shown that when we look at retrieval practice and we compare it to any other type of study method, whether it is rereading the content, watching the videos of the content, underlining, whatever it is, people who use retrieval practice do better. And they do better in the following ways. They retain their learning for longer, so they're less likely to forget it as time goes by. They learn more in the same period of time. So if you've got 30 minutes to study and you use retrieval practice, you're going to learn more in that period of time than any other type of study method that you use. And that's what this next line says. Retrieval practice also enhances transfer. So that's a technical term for essentially being able to apply the things that you've learned in a new setting. So a lot of what I do is teaching medical students or students who want to be medical students. We learn together in a lecture theatre. What I want them to be able to do is take the learning from that lecture theatre and then apply that in the wards or in a GP surgery or with patients. That is transfer. Transfer is enhanced when we learn using retrieval practice. There's a final additional benefit to retrieval practice, which is that it reduces test anxiety. That's what that Yang 2023 reference is there at the bottom. Lots of us don't like taking exams. We don't like doing tests. We don't like writing assignments. It makes us stressed. It makes us anxious. The best way, or one of the best ways to reduce that anxiety, that stress, is to take lots of practice tests. And that meta-analysis from a couple of years ago now showed that students who had to take an exam who did lots of practice exams. Their learning was enhanced because of retrieval practice, and then their anxiety when they went into the exam was reduced because they had done lots of practice. That also then shows you, what are you learning? What are you not learning? Where are you getting things right? Where are you getting things wrong? Where do you need to focus your efforts? And just shows you what success looks like, which then reduces the stress of the assessment itself. Some practical tips for doing this type of retrieval practice. How often should I do it? Is a question that comes up quite often. The answer to that is do it as often as you can. If you're watching back some lectures that you're revising for, then do some practice questions on that, or write some practice questions on that straight away, and then do it again and again and again as often as you can. How should I do it is a question that comes up quite often when we're teaching students study strategies. They say, should I write down everything I know, or should I take some practice multiple choice questions, for example? If you're doing retrieval practice, the best way to do it is to what we call free recall. So that example I gave you where you write down everything you know on a subject, that's free recall. That doesn't have a structure to it. It's just you bring up everything that you know. All of your prior knowledge comes to the surface. If you do that, then the retrieval practice is the very best that it can be, unless your free recall brings up prior knowledge that is incorrect. Okay, so if you've learned something or you recall something that's incorrect, then using free recall for your retrieval practice will actually strengthen and reinforce the incorrect learning. So unless you're doing it with people that you're confident who you know can give you corrective feedback, what we tend to suggest is to use multiple choice questions. You can write those, check those, and then use those later on in your revision. And then in a multiple choice question, you can designate one of the answers as being correct, the rest are incorrect, and then you're not going to retrieve and relearn and strengthen the incorrect answer. So in terms of retrieval practice, when preparing for assessments, take practice assessments, write practice assessments, do it as much as you can, do it as soon as you can after you've done the revision or rewatch the lectures or whatever it is. It's very effective and it reduces stress anxiety because it drives retrieval. So that's the first and the main thing, that whenever we're giving anyone advice about how to revise, we say do retrieval practice. Just going to finish with a few other suggestions based upon the limitations of human working memory. So I read out that list of words. You tried to remember it for a few seconds. You struggle to do that. We all struggle to do that. And that's because working memory that you were trying to use to do that has a lot of limitations to it. Human working memory, to be blunt, is terrible. If you think about what working memory is, if you want a computing analogy, it's really real-time information processing. When we go about the world, most of what we do when we're looking, we're listening, we're tasting, we're touching, we're experiencing real-time processing of sensory information. But most of what our conscious perception is really a prediction based upon our prior knowledge. Think about visual illusions or any type of illusion. Those work because they trick your prior knowledge. We're really bad at processing information in real time. And most of what we're doing, most of what consciousness is perceiving new information, perceiving the real world in real time, and then making a guess about what it is that we're seeing, hearing, and experiencing based upon prior knowledge. The fact that working memory is terrible, but nevertheless is essential for learning, is another great challenge for effective teaching, for effective revision. And there are lots of ways that we can account for this. There are lots of theories of education that account for this. Cognitive load theory is one of these. The science of learning is another one. I'm going to show you just some basic tips and tricks from these two approaches. Lots of the old psychology proposes that the capacity of working memory is between 4 to 7 chunks of information. And the means by which we become expert is by increasing the size of that chunk. All right, so if I ask you to remember, for example, a string of random numbers, then you will struggle to remember more than 7 random numbers. If you're from Swansea and I ask you to remember a phone number that's 7 numbers long, but then has the Swansea area code of 01792, you'll be able to remember a string of 11 or 12 numbers, because you've learned that the area code for Swansea is 01792. And those 01792, those 5 numbers, become one chunk in your working memory, for example. Because I'm a neuroscientist, I just want to sneak in a picture of a brain, and also just to show you where working memory lives, which is just about here. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's sort of on your temples. If you play a lot of football, be careful when you're heading the ball, because working memory is really important. Struggling with working memory really can impair learning because it's not very good to start with. And if you bang it about a bit, it's going to get even worse. And a simple strategy for making the most of the limited working memory capacity that we have comes in 2 basic statements: avoid distractors and avoid unnecessary mental work. Now, we could talk for a couple of hours about some examples of this. Distractors, obviously very straightforward. If you're trying to study, put your phone somewhere else. Don't have TikTok or X or Instagram or whatever it is to hand. Try not to have the TV or any other type of distraction on, unless you're using it as white noise to block out any other sounds. Have somewhere nice and quiet, free from distraction, and then break your time down into a short period of study. I'll talk about that in a second. The other key feature of lots of these approaches to teaching, revision, and assessment that prioritize the limitations of human working memory are to avoid unnecessary mental work. Now, when we say unnecessary mental work, we don't have a lot of control over the work that our working memory is doing. So lots of things are distracting and we have very little control over them. Some of them can be sounds coming from the TV, can be notifications coming from our phone, for example. Some of them can be in the way that we organize our revision notes or our lecture notes or whatever they may be. Keep everything as simple as you possibly can, focused on the key things, and you will be in good shape. Let me give you a little bit more detail about some of these then. So one really effective study and teaching strategy that we teach throughout our different courses is what's called spaced practice. Now, spaced practice comes from the basic idea that long chunks of study are ineffective. Okay, and we all try and organize our university programs around this. We certainly advise people to organize their revision around this. Rather than studying in one big chunk, what we say to people to do is to break the chunks up into smaller pieces. And then what do you do in between the smaller pieces? You interleave. So rather than doing a long big chunk of biology and then a long big chunk of chemistry and a long big chunk of maths, we say break them up into bite-sized pieces. Now, it's a very common question to say, how long is a chunk that's too long? And the answer to that is unsatisfactory, because it really does depend. But what I say to students who are revising is, we've all revised and we've all reached that point in our revision where things are just not going in. And for some of us, it might be half an hour, maybe even 15 minutes if we're learning something really complicated. Some of us may be able to revise for 2 or 3 hours, but there'll be some point during that revision where we're reading it, or we're taking the practice questions, or we're watching the videos again, and nothing is happening. And what we say to people is, that is the time to interleave, to space out your practice. Because the natural thing for us to want to do at a time like that is to reach for our phone, check social media, stare inside the fridge and see what the fridge has to offer as a way of distraction. It can be good to take a break, but it is better to get straight back on with studying, but don't go back to the thing that you were struggling with before. Study something different. So that point where you hit the wall, nothing's going in, take a break, have a drink, have a sandwich, go back to studying, but do something different, interleave something similar. So if you're learning biology for, I don't know, for a biological sciences degree, rather than carrying on studying the biology, study some relevant chemistry or study some relevant maths. And then when you hit the wall with that, switch to a different subject. Essentially, every time you feel like nothing is going in, switch to something else. And that is the best way to operationalize interleaving. The final point I'll leave you with is what the psychologists call dual coding. Now, I'm going to really simplify the neuroscience here, and apologies to those of you who do have a neuroscience background, but this simplistic explanation I feel is still useful enough for us to operationalize in ways that are useful for people who are advising. Very, very simply, when we learn something, we code it in two different ways. One of the ways we code it is into words or into speech or into some verbal format. And another way that we code it is into a visual or a picture format. It is best wherever you can to learn things in both ways. That is what dual coding essentially proposes. So let's say you're trying to learn something that is based on text. You're reading a long passage of text. You read the text, you try and learn the text, then try and draw a picture of what that text represents. Or if you're learning something that's visual, let's say you're learning the anatomy, the external anatomy of the brain, you learn that using visual information, then write a text description of what it is that the images are showing to you. Essentially, if you're learning text, also try and learn it as pictures. If you're learning pictures, also try and learn it as text. If you can only do one, pictures tend to be better than text. So if you've got a choice and a limited amount of time, learn through pictures. But the best way to learn is dual coding. Learn things in both ways. And that strengthens the learning in both formats and means that then your performance on a test or an exam of that information is going to be better. Okay, so that's all from me. I'll just summarize and then go over to some questions. In simple summary, your ability to learn things is amazing. We've not been able to map human long-term memory because it seems almost limitless. We don't even really forget things. We just overwrite things with new information. But to get into long-term memory, you've got to get through working memory. And human working memory is absolutely awful. All of us have it. It's awful. The best way to learn then is to help out working memory, taking quizzes, writing quizzes or tests, whatever you want to call them. Try not to overload it, including overloading it with things that are irrelevant. And then the final study tip that I give that's normally relevant for university students, perhaps more than people of an advanced stage like me, is all of this stuff happens best when we are sleeping. So if you want one non-directly revision related study strategy that will help you with all of your performance in revision and in the subsequent exams, it is to sleep. Go to bed early, just keep all the screens out of the room, make the room dark, make it cold, make yourself nice and warm in bed. And sleeping really, really, really is essential for human learning because so much of the integration with the things that we've learned during the day with our prior knowledge happens repeatedly during the cycles of rapid eye movement sleep, which happen obviously while we're sleeping, but in particular happen in the later stages of sleep. So you really need to make sure you're getting those 7 or 8 hours because it's in hours 6, 7, and 8 that the consolidation of new learning happens best. And with that, I will say, if you've got any questions that we can't answer here, that's my email address. I think if you've got any questions about any of our programs, I think study at Swansea UK, swansea.ac.uk is the best email address to pose those questions to, although I defer to Bethany for that. We also have a YouTube channel where some of our basic neuroscience and some of these study strategies are also hosted. And I will stop sharing and I will hand back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much
I
to
cannot hear
Professor
you though,
Newton.
Bethany, which is possibly
Oh,
a problem for me. There we go.
there we are. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to Professor Newton. I mean, I certainly learned some hints and tips there. And I know that, some of you are going to be approaching your exams perhaps sooner rather than others, depending on what qualifications you're going to be studying for. But I think there's some really useful information in there. Certainly from my recall at the moment, the sort of doing those practice tests is going to be really important. So whether your school has got access to those, and also working with your classmates, your friends to get together and revise as a group, to kind of do that recall and then perhaps quiz each other, have fun with it, just to try and consolidate that learning. And obviously sleep is a great thing.
Please, please do sleep. Please sleep, people. It's really good.
Yeah, I think we all know people who will revise for hours and hours and just try and push through the sleep to, I think, like Professor Newton said, it reaches a point where you can't take any more information in, and it's kind of counterproductive then. You know, so it's definitely better to have a good productive learning session and then have a good night's sleep to make sure that your brain has a chance to consolidate that information. So let's go through sort of to the questions. Please, ask any questions in the Q&A function. We can get to those. I do have some questions. I think a lot of these questions have kind of in some way, shape and form already been answered within the presentation, but just perhaps to revisit some of these is, I think this is quite a good question, is, what in our brain is responsible for one learning method being better for others, for individuals?
Okay. So individualized learning, that's a very good question. I think the first thing to say is that the sorts of limitations that there are on learning that we talked about just now, they pretty much apply to everyone. There are some people with fantastic working memory, and there are some people whose working memory perhaps doesn't work as well as we would want it to on average. But for almost all of us, working memory is terrible, but it is a bottleneck for learning. And so even though we have individualized individual differences in how we prefer to learn, that basic principle will apply to all of us. And the same with them with retrieval practice, interleaving, space practice, etc. There is a lot of information, a lot of literature out there about so-called learning styles. And the idea of learning styles is, for example, that supposedly certain people are maybe visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners or read-write learners or something like that. And lots of people have made a lot of money out of these supposed approaches to learning over the years, but there doesn't really seem to be any evidence that they're effective. Some people certainly prefer to learn things in different ways to other people. So I prefer to keep pressing buttons on new devices until they work. My wife prefers to open the instruction manual, read it from cover to cover, and then before she even plugs in a new device. Having a preference for the way that you learn can be comforting, but at the end of the day, we mostly learn in the same way. Having preferences for the environment in which you do the learning, the caffeinated beverage you may have on hand to help you with that, those can all be helpful, but at the end of the day, learning is probably still learning and all requires the same brain regions, mostly in all of us. So I would say don't be too seduced by promises of individualized learning when it's probably better to focus on the limitations that we all have.
Fantastic. And I think you do have sort of covered it in terms of, planning the revision, but there's two questions which kind of covers. One is, how is the best way to plan your revision in the last sort of few weeks, months as you approach exams? And the second part of that would be how to battle kind of apathy towards the studies as you might be spending quite a lot of time doing that revision.
So in terms of planning, I think if you're the sort of person that's asking a question and attending a neuroscience a revision webinar in the middle of March, you're probably going to be in good shape. And it doesn't mean it's not going to be stressful or difficult, but thinking about planning at this stage, you should be fine. I would, in terms of structuring then my study and my revision, I would break it up so that rather than learning everything from a particular subject or a module in one particular go, I would do maybe even half an hour at a time of related subjects, or an hour, or depending on how comfortable I was. And I would always structure in writing practice questions, sharing those practice questions, answering those practice questions, etc. What I say to let's deal with the apathy question. Apathy, I suspect, is in large part becoming overloaded in the way that I talked about, where things have just stopped going in. We all feel like that whenever we've got a deadline. And for some of us, myself included, it's not until the deadline is ramping up that the stress of the deadline maybe destroys the apathy. It's not the situation we want to be in. And so structuring, planning in advance might be the best way of dealing with the apathy. But also, I think probably don't beat yourself up too much about it. It happens to lots of us. We're all human. What I say to the medical students in particular, who have a lot of information to learn, is that cramming studying the nights before an exam is the worst study strategy that there is, unless you haven't done anything else. And so there is a place for cramming. If you got to the night before and you feel like you haven't learned enough, don't give up then. You can use cramming to get through in the short term assessments. It's by far and away the least effective approach to studying unless you haven't done anything else. And then, there's still time. There's always time before an assessment to learn a little bit more and practice a little bit more. I hope that answers your question.
Great. I think key message is just to, as the question implied, it's that planning factor. Make sure that you are planning it, that you're scheduling it, rather than having to resort to cramming, if that schedule hasn't sort of happened beforehand. So I'm going to give it another moment just to see if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask using the Q&A function. Perhaps whilst you are thinking of any questions that you'd like to ask, I'm just going to briefly share a slide with you so that you can sort of ask any questions that you might, if any further questions once we finish the session. So Professor Newton finally kindly shared his email address, but if you do have any sort of questions either about perhaps any revision skills, then we can try and direct to Professor Newton, or if this has inspired you, hopefully, and you've got an interest in either neuroscience or any of the programs that we offer here at sort of Swansea within our faculty, please do send us an email on studyfmhls@swansea.ac.uk, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Just can give it a moment just to see if you need to make a note of that email, but don't worry if you've missed it, because as I say, I am recording the session and we'll be sharing the content with you later on today. Okay. Well, I can't see any further questions, so we'll round up today's revision skills hints and tips session. Thank you so much to Professor Newton for taking the time to deliver that really informative and fun session. I think and hope that will give you lots of kind of hints and tips as you approach your upcoming exams. We at Swansea wish you all of the best of luck in whatever exams you have upcoming, and perhaps we may even see some of you in Swansea and have the opportunity to welcome you. So thank you so much for everyone to join. Thanks very much, Professor Newton.
Good
Goodbye,
luck,
everyone.
folks. Bye-bye.